I used to believe that brutal divorces only happened in movies or in the overly dramatized pages of tabloids. The scathing accusations, the vicious courtroom battles over assets, the crocodile tears shed on witness stands, I thought those things belonged to another world, one far removed from mine. I never imagined that one day I would find myself at the center of a story like that, a main character in a tragedy I never saw coming. And the most terrifying part, it didn't come like a storm. I was in my office when it arrived. The same office I had built from scratch, the one where I had spent countless nights working until dawn, the one I once thought I would grow old in. I clicked open the email casually, expecting perhaps a meeting reminder or an investor update. Instead, I saw my name next to legal language I had never wanted to see. A brief, impersonal note informing me that my wife, the woman I had shared a decade of my life with, had filed for divorce. No explanation. Our marriage from the outside had looked like a dream. I was a software engineer turned tech entrepreneur. She was an art teacher with a gentle soul and boundless creativity. I built the company, she built our home. I worked long hours chasing investors. She created the emotional safety net that kept me grounded. She used to say I was her whole world, but now she wanted half of mine, half of the company, half the assets, half of everything, and more. She demanded 50% of my shares in the business, long-term spousal support for the next 10 years, and full ownership of the house I had paid almost entirely for. Reading through the list of demands, I felt like I was being extorted not by a stranger, but by my own wife. Everything I had spent my youth building was now being weighed and measured on a legal scale. We had once shared everything, dreams, meals, debts, and fears. In the early days, we lived in a cramped apartment where the walls were thin and the floorboards creaked. We didn't have much, but we had each other. I remember nights where we sat on the floor eating instant noodles, watching rain spill down the windows, and imagining the life we would someday have. A house, a family, stability. Back then, our poverty was a shared challenge, a bond, not a burden. As the years passed, things changed. My company began to grow, slowly at first, then rapidly. Investors came knocking. The long nights and empty bank accounts turned into busy calendars and rising valuations. She offered to quit her teaching job to take care of things at home to make it easier for me to focus on the business. I didn't argue. I was grateful. She managed the household, ran errands, took care of our parents, and made our home a sanctuary from the chaos outside. But somewhere along the way, a rift opened between us. I didn't see it clearly at first. I was too busy, too tired, too naive. She became quieter, distant. I chalked it up to stress, to routine. I thought love was supposed to survive dry spells, that it didn't need constant watering. I started noticing her withdrawal more, the way she barely reacted when I brought home gifts, the way she turned down weekend trips, the way she avoided eye contact at dinner. I thought she needed space. I gave it. Looking back, the signs were obvious. She had already started planning her exit. The woman who once lay beside me whispering dreams of the future had turned those dreams into blueprints for legal separation. Not only did she want out, but she wanted to leave with as much of my world in her hands as she could legally claim. And the part that cut the deepest wasn't the money. It wasn't even the house or the company. It was the betrayal of trust. The realization that the person you once shared your most vulnerable moments with could one day treat you like a hostile opponent in a courtroom. I began going through bank records. Transactions I had never questioned now looked suspicious. Investments I thought were joint decisions turned out to be registered under her sister's name. Shared credit cards had charges I didn't recognize. At first, I wondered if I was being paranoid, but the more I looked, the more I found. It became clear that she hadn't just fallen out of love. She had planned her departure meticulously, step by step, move by calculated move. I tried to understand where things had gone wrong. Had I been so absorbed in my business that I missed the signs? Was I to blame for her feeling unseen, unloved? I wrestled with guilt, shame, anger, and confusion. But at the heart of it all was a single, painful truth. Love had turned to strategy. Affection had turned into asset allocation. The weeks after that email were the darkest of my life. I didn't eat properly. I didn't sleep. I avoided friends and family. I went to work, but I wasn't really there. My mind played a loop of memories, the vacations, the anniversaries, the small rituals of a shared life, and with each memory came a sting, because now I had to question if any of it had been real. Some nights I would sit in the living room staring at the wedding photo on the wall. We looked so happy in it, so certain. I wanted to step into that photo, warn that version of me about what was coming. I wondered if I would have still married her, knowing how it would end. And I couldn't answer. Eventually, I signed the divorce papers, not because I agreed, but because I needed to pause, to breathe, to collect myself. I needed to protect what I had left, my sanity, my dignity, and the fragments of my life that hadn't yet been dismantled. I didn't respond immediately with lawyers and threats. I wanted time. Time to understand, to grieve, and eventually to fight back not out of revenge, but out of principle. I realized that this wasn't just a breakup. This was a war, one that would be fought not with tears or pleading, but with evidence, legal strategy, and a spine made of steel. I had spent years building my business, my reputation, my future. I wasn't going to let it all be sliced away without resistance. But before the battle, I had to mourn. Mourn not just the woman I lost, but the version of myself that believed in her blindly. The part of me that thought love was forever if you just worked hard enough. That boy on the rainy apartment floor, full of hope and promises, he was gone. In his place stood a man who had learned that even the deepest bonds can snap under the pressure of ambition, resentment, and silent betrayal. That was the day my marriage shattered. Not with a scream, not with a slammed door, but with a silent email that severed a decade in seconds. After the initial shock wore off and the numbness receded, a cold, burning clarity began to take its place. I was no longer a husband trying to understand a failing marriage. I was a man standing at the edge of a legal war zone. And if I didn't act quickly and intelligently, I would lose everything, not just my company, but the years I had poured into building something out of nothing. The time for grieving was over. Now was the time to fight. I began assembling a legal team. I didn't want just any lawyer, I wanted someone ruthless, someone who had seen it all and would not be moved by tears or theatrics. Through a former colleague who had gone through a bitter divorce himself, I was introduced to a woman named Judith Kaplan. Her reputation preceded her. She had a steel-cold demeanor, a sharp mind, and a track record of clawing back impossible cases from the brink of ruin. We began by dissecting every aspect of my marriage. No detail was too small, no memory too insignificant. We went through tax filings, bank records, company valuations, property documents, emails, texts, old calendars, and even social media posts. Every date, every financial transaction, every flight, hotel stay, and purchase was cataloged and cross-referenced. I felt like I was reliving the last 10 years under a forensic microscope. In the meantime, the other side came prepared. My wife, I still caught myself using that word, though it now felt foreign, had retained a highly expensive family law firm known for aggressive strategies. They filed motion after motion, requesting discovery on all my personal and business finances. They sought psychological evaluations, spousal maintenance, even retroactive compensation for lost career opportunities during the marriage. It became clear that this wasn't just about ending a relationship. They painted a picture of me as an emotionally absent husband, obsessed with my work, neglectful at home, selfish with money, and indifferent to her sacrifices. According to their narrative, she had given up her career to support my dreams, borne the emotional labor of the relationship, and now deserved a significant share of everything I had built. It was a familiar story, one that courts often sympathize with. On paper, it even looked plausible, but it wasn't the truth. What they didn't account for was the mountain of documentation I had. My meticulous financial records, the thousands of emails between us, the transaction logs, the personal journals I had kept sporadically over the years. There were messages where she explicitly stated she didn't want to work anymore, not out of sacrifice, but because she found teaching unfulfilling. There were receipts showing that her contributions to the household were largely funded by me. Judith built the defense like an architect. Every fact had to support another. Every document had to be corroborated. We mapped a timeline of the entire relationship, overlaying it with financial milestones, emotional changes, and legal exposure. I began to see my life laid out like a case file, detached, clinical, organized into categories. It was surreal and disorienting, but it was also empowering. We filed a counter-motion. Not only did we dispute her claims, but we presented our own. Hidden assets, misuse of joint funds, investments under third-party names. We weren't just defending, we were attacking. And that shifted the dynamic completely. The courtroom became a second home. I grew used to the polished floors, the scent of paper and old wood, the hushed voices of legal assistants shuffling past. Each day felt like a battle, slow, deliberate, and emotionally exhausting. My ex-wife sat on the other side of the room, composed, dressed in carefully chosen colors that evoked sympathy. Her lawyers spoke in calm, persuasive tones. It would have been compelling if I hadn't known better, if I hadn't lived those years myself. Judith began to unravel their narrative piece by piece. She introduced our digital correspondence, emails that showed not only mutual consent, but also a level of financial and personal transparency that directly contradicted their claims. We brought in a financial auditor who testified about the real origin of our investments. We revealed the hidden real estate purchases in her sister's name, financed quietly using company dividends and offshore transfers. But even so, the weight of the process wore on me. I was not built for this kind of war. I was a creator, a builder, not a litigator. I woke up each day feeling a mix of anxiety and resentment. I stopped seeing friends. I barely spoke to my team at work. The headlines didn't help either. Some journalists caught wind of the case and twisted it into a scandalous story. One particularly cruel headline dubbed me the greedy tech mogul who refused to support his wife. My company began to feel the tremors. A few investors grew cold. One even pulled out of a major funding round. Employees began whispering. HR received anonymous complaints. I could feel the judgment in the way people looked at me, not openly, but in the subtle silences, the tight-lipped greetings. I had worked so hard to build a culture of transparency, of trust, and now my personal life was contaminating it all. Yet I couldn't afford to break down. I forced myself to focus on the strategy. I reviewed affidavits late into the night. I annotated pages of court transcripts. I memorized dates, timelines, financial ratios. The fight had consumed my life completely. And slowly my grief hardened into something else, not hatred, but resolve. I was no longer trying to understand why she did what she did. I was here to ensure she didn't succeed in rewriting our history in her favor. One of the hardest days was when we presented the internal footage from our home's security system, audio-free but damning. It showed long periods where she was alone in the house, contradicting her claims of being a full-time homemaker. It showed her bringing over a man she later claimed she barely knew, months before she filed for divorce. The footage didn't lie, and even in its silence it spoke volumes. The judge was impartial, but I could sense the shift in the room. The more evidence we presented, the harder it became for the other side to maintain their narrative. I saw it in her eyes, a flicker of unease. For the first time, she didn't look so confident. She looked cornered. Still, the court was careful. No dramatic rulings, no slamming gavels, just slow, deliberate consideration. Legal proceedings are never like the movies. There are no shouting matches or sudden reversals. Just cold facts presented through procedure and paperwork, one excruciating inch at a time. When the court finally reached its initial decision, it wasn't a sweeping victory, but it was enough to hold the line. The division of assets was frozen pending investigation into the offshore accounts. The motion for prolonged spousal support was denied temporarily. The ownership of the house was placed in legal escrow. It wasn't over, but for the first time I felt like the tide was no longer against me. I walked out of the courtroom that day into the gray winter light. The air was cold. My hands were trembling, though I hadn't noticed. I stood still for a moment, trying to absorb what had just happened. For the first time in months, I felt something resembling relief. Not triumph, not joy, just the absence of panic, and that was enough. But I knew the fight wasn't done. We had only made it through the first half. The appeal process, the financial reviews, the next wave of motions, they were all waiting. The war had simply entered its next phase, but now I was ready. No longer the man who received an email and collapsed. I was something else now. Wounded, yes, but awake. Victory in court is not a destination. It's a pause, brief, fleeting before the next wave comes. I thought I had weathered the worst. I believed the weight of the truth, once revealed, would be enough to tilt the scales permanently. But I was wrong. The law isn't interested in who hurts more. It is bound by documents, precedent, interpretation. Justice is rarely a clean slice. More often, it's a splintered compromise, one that no one walks away from feeling whole. The judge's initial ruling stalled the asset division and rejected her request for long-term spousal support. For a few weeks, I could breathe. My house was no longer in immediate jeopardy. My company's financials were out of reach, but the reprieve was temporary. I should have known better. People like Lily don't accept partial outcomes. For her, anything less than total victory felt like betrayal. And so she came back harder. She filed a second lawsuit, this time under a civil claim for emotional distress, claiming that the marriage had caused her irreversible psychological trauma and long-term financial suppression. It was a creative strategy, the kind of thing her legal team likely had in their back pocket all along, waiting for the right moment to strike. She wasn't just aiming for money now, she was targeting my reputation, my emotional stability, my ability to live without constant litigation hanging over my head. The claim itself was ridiculous, but it didn't need to be reasonable. It only needed to be plausible enough to warrant a full hearing. And that meant months, if not years, of further proceedings, more legal fees, more depositions, more hours spent going over every line of our marriage under a magnifying glass, as if each moment held some coded confession of guilt. I began to unravel. The house, the one I had designed myself, from the floor plan to the custom light fixtures, was now a place of silence and tension. I found myself avoiding certain rooms. Her perfume still lingered faintly in the walk-in closet. I boxed up the photos, the drawings, the little artifacts of a life that no longer felt real. I couldn't bear to look at the evidence of the man I used to be, the one who believed in love without a fallback plan. Work became a tightrope. I tried to put on a brave face. I smiled in meetings, reviewed product roadmaps, gave performance reviews, but the truth was I was slipping. I couldn't concentrate. My inbox became a mountain I didn't have the strength to climb. I missed investor calls. Rumors started to circulate. Some thought I was planning to sell. Others believed I was quietly stepping back due to health issues. Then the media got involved. It began with a niche tech blog that ran a speculative piece about my messy high-stakes divorce. Then a tabloid picked it up. Within days, my name was smeared across headlines that ranged from sensational to outright defamatory. "Cold-blooded CEO leaves wife penniless after affair," one article screamed. Another suggested I had used company funds to buy gifts for a mistress, a complete fabrication, but one that traveled faster than any retraction ever could. I lost 2 major contracts within a week. One partner pulled out without even a courtesy call. Another told me politely but firmly that they couldn't afford the association. My CFO called me into his office one morning with a look that said everything. "We need stability," he said, not in those words, but in the coded language of boardrooms and burn rates. I knew what he was telling me: step back, become invisible, or risk the company unraveling with me. So I did. I took a leave of absence, announced it as a personal hiatus for mental health and reflection. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had become exactly the thing they said I was: unstable, unavailable, a liability. But it wasn't because I had failed as a leader. It was because I had trusted someone who weaponized my love, my openness, and my past against me with surgical precision. I moved into a small apartment on the edge of the city. Nothing fancy. 1 bedroom, exposed brick, a view of the back alley, and a laundromat. It was the kind of place I would have rented in my 20s, back when I believed struggle was romantic and possibility was infinite. Now it felt like exile. I furnished it with the bare minimum: a bed, a desk, a second-hand couch I found online. No pictures on the wall, no reminders of who I used to be. Nights became unbearable. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how it had all fallen apart so completely. I replayed conversations, scanned old emails, reread birthday cards she had written in another lifetime. I searched for signs I had missed, clues that the love had rotted before I noticed. But memory is cruel. It doesn't preserve events in sequence. It blurs them, blends joy with regret until both feel unreal. I drank too much. I stopped answering texts. My phone became a burden. Notifications felt like reminders of a life I no longer belonged to. I let calls from friends go to voicemail, too ashamed to explain how far I had fallen. My world narrowed to the space between my kitchen sink and my desk. Some mornings I didn't shower. Some nights I didn't sleep. I existed in a suspended state, a ghost haunting a timeline that no longer included me. And yet in that void, something shifted. I began to write. At first, it was nothing more than journal entries, incoherent, bitter, grief-laced paragraphs scribbled into a file on my laptop. But the more I wrote, the more I realized I wasn't just venting. I was reconstructing the truth, my truth. Not the one they had painted in courtrooms and media narratives, but the raw, unfiltered story of a man who gave everything to love, only to be dismantled piece by piece. I wrote about the silence between us in the last year of marriage, the way she stopped laughing at my jokes, the way she avoided eye contact in the mornings. I wrote about the dinner parties where she smiled for the crowd but looked right through me. I wrote about the betrayal, not just the legal ambush, but the emotional withdrawal that preceded it. The years she spent preparing for an exit while I still believed we were building a future. I wrote until the pain stopped feeling sharp. It became something else, structured, bearable, even purposeful. Writing was the only thing that made sense anymore. It was the only place where I had complete control over the narrative. The only place where her lawyers couldn't twist my words, where the media couldn't distort my intent. In the background, the legal machinery kept grinding. Hearings, motions, depositions. Her team tried to freeze my remaining assets. They filed additional complaints. The pressure was relentless, but it no longer had the power to devastate me. I had already lost everything I thought I couldn't live without. What more could they take? Eventually, Judith found something, a thread we hadn't pulled yet. It was a minor detail buried in a set of bank transfers. A pattern, a name, an inconsistency in dates. It led to a revelation so staggering I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She hadn't acted alone. There was another man, a name that appeared on multiple documents, always at a distance, always just out of focus. Further investigation confirmed it. He was her financial advisor, her confidant, and her lover. They had coordinated the timing of the divorce, planned the financial ambush, even mapped out the public relations strategy in case things turned ugly. This wasn't heartbreak. It was an operation, surgical, cold, methodical. I remember sitting in the investigator's office, looking at the photos, the bank statements, the messages. I felt nothing, no rage, no betrayal, just silence, the kind that comes after a building has collapsed and the dust hasn't settled yet. I wasn't shocked. I was free, because now finally I understood. She didn't leave because we were broken. She left because it was profitable. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle pressure. Years of building my company had taught me to compartmentalize, to focus on the task at hand even when everything around me was chaos. But this was different. This wasn't about software bugs or investor disagreements. This wasn't even about a competitive market or a tough product launch. This was personal. The days after I discovered the truth about Lily's betrayal were strange. I was no longer in freefall. I wasn't consumed by the legal battle nor the media circus that surrounded it. Instead, I was left with this numbness, a profound, heavy stillness, like the world had become silent and I was the only one left standing. I thought I had already faced the worst, but I soon realized that the hardest part was not the fights in the courtroom or the media slander. It was the quiet aftermath. I had no idea what to do next. In one way, everything was ruined. My marriage was over. My professional reputation had been dragged through the mud. Even the financial stability I had once prided myself on felt like a distant memory. The things I used to take for granted, my house, my company, the image of myself as a successful, confident man, no longer felt like mine. They had been taken from me bit by bit, and I wasn't sure who I was without them. But amid the emptiness, a small part of me began to stir. A quiet voice, barely a whisper, reminding me that I still had something I couldn't lose, something no one could take away. I still had my mind. I still had my ability to think, to create, to rebuild. I started by taking long walks around the city. I had lived in the same place for over 10 years, but now everything felt unfamiliar. The streets I had once walked with confidence now felt like strange paths, as if I were a foreigner in my own life. I walked in silence, letting the world around me continue while I simply observed. I didn't have any grand plans. I didn't know what I was hoping to find. Sometimes I would walk for hours, letting my mind drift. There were days when I would pass by people laughing in the park or see couples holding hands, and a sharp pang would hit me, a painful reminder of what I had lost. Other days I would see someone walking their dog or a child on a bicycle, and I would wonder if they, too, felt like they were carrying invisible burdens. I had no desire to join them, not yet. I was still lost, still trying to figure out how to piece together a life that felt like it had been torn apart at the seams. But the walks helped. They gave me space. They gave me room to breathe, to think, to process. One day, on one of those long walks, I found myself standing in front of a small bookstore I had never noticed before. It was tucked away between two larger buildings, easy to overlook. There was something about it, a quiet, unassuming presence that drew me in. I pushed the door open, and the smell of old paper and coffee greeted me. The bookstore was small, cluttered with stacks of books in every corner, but it felt like a sanctuary. I spent the next few hours wandering the aisles, not looking for anything in particular, just letting the words on the spines guide me. I picked up a book on philosophy, then set it back down. I skimmed through a collection of poetry, then put it back on the shelf. Eventually, I found myself in the section on self-help, and I paused. I had never been the type to read those kinds of books. To me, they always seemed overly simplistic, full of empty promises. But now, in the midst of everything, something about the idea of reclaiming my life, of finding my way out of this darkness, felt appealing. I picked up a book titled The Art of Reinvention and sat down in a chair by the window. The book was not groundbreaking. It didn't offer any quick fixes or easy solutions. But it had one thing that I needed: perspective. The author talked about how change, even the most painful kind, could be a form of liberation. How, in order to move forward, you sometimes had to strip away everything you thought you knew about yourself and start from scratch. It wasn't about fixing what was broken. It was a hard pill to swallow. I wasn't ready to let go of the person I used to be, the person I thought I had been. But as I sat there, flipping through the pages, I felt a small shift inside of me. Maybe it was time to stop trying to repair what had been broken. Maybe it was time to create something entirely new. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. I bought the book and left the bookstore, stepping out into the world with a new sense of possibility. It wasn't a grand epiphany. I didn't suddenly have all the answers, but I knew I was taking the first step toward something, toward myself, toward a future that didn't have to be defined by the past. In the weeks that followed, I focused on one thing: rebuilding, not my company, not my reputation, but myself. I spent time reading, reflecting, writing. I picked up new hobbies I had always wanted to try but had never made the time for. I took up painting, something I had always admired from a distance but had never attempted. It wasn't about becoming an artist. It was about giving myself permission to create without any expectations, without any pressure. I started exercising again, not to get back in shape, but to reconnect with my body. I had neglected my physical health during the last years of my marriage, focusing entirely on work and the constant drama. But now, I realized that my body was just as important as my mind. The days I spent in the gym or running along the beach gave me a sense of strength I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about appearance. Slowly, I began to piece together the fragments of my life. The legal battles still continued, but they no longer consumed me. I had learned to let go of the outcome. I was no longer waiting for validation or for some external force to tell me that I had succeeded or failed. I had started to define success on my own terms. I met with my team at work again. I didn't step back completely, but I was no longer the man I had been before. I wasn't the CEO driven solely by ambition and fear. I was a man who had faced unimaginable loss and come through it. I had learned to trust myself again. And then one day I received a letter. It was from Lily's lawyer. She had dropped all further claims. The legal battle was over. The war that had been waged for so long had come to an unexpected and quiet end. It was anticlimactic. There was no sense of triumph, no moment of victory, just an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in years, I felt a peace I hadn't known was possible, not because everything was perfect, but because I had finally let go of the need for it to be. I had found my way out of the darkness, not by fighting it, but by accepting it and walking through it. I didn't need to destroy her to rebuild myself. I didn't need revenge. All I needed was to reclaim my life piece by piece, and in the quiet of that moment, I realized that I had already done it. I once thought the final hearing would be a mere formality, a symbolic end to everything. But I was wrong. It wasn't just a conclusion. It was the only moment in this excruciating journey where I could truly reclaim my voice. I was no longer a defendant dragged into a legal game designed to strip me bare. This time, I was the one setting the tempo, the one putting the truth on the table, piece by piece. I remember that first morning of the retrial vividly. The sky was overcast, heavy with the kind of stillness that wraps around your chest. I sat behind the wheel of my car, parked outside the courthouse, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. But this time, fear was no longer the dominant feeling. There was a quiet resolve, a stillness inside me, not from emptiness, but from a strange, focused clarity. For months, my attorney, the private investigator, and I had prepared a war chest of evidence. Financial statements, encrypted emails, bank transfers, surveillance footage, even photos from an airport camera where Lily had secretly met Charles. I memorized transaction histories, decoded correspondence, and pored over every detail I had once overlooked. Every piece was a shard of truth, once fractured, now forming a map of betrayal. When I entered the courtroom, Lily was already there. She sat poised, hair perfectly styled, face painted in the mask of composed professionalism. But I noticed something new. She wouldn't look at me. Not out of regret, but fear. She knew what I held in my hands this time. She knew the carefully constructed walls around her were starting to crack. The hearings stretched on for months. The courtroom became a theater of truths and half-truths, layered with witness statements, expert testimony, and the occasional gasp from a bored observer realizing the scandal was deeper than they thought. I sat still through it all, letting every false accusation wash over me like rain on stone. There was no need to react anymore. I knew that silence could sometimes roar louder than rage. The real turning point came when the anonymous bank account surfaced. A line item buried in months of statements, a transfer to an offshore account under the name of Lily's so-called legal advisor, who just so happened to be the man she was secretly dating. For the first time, the air in the courtroom turned cold. Lily's composure cracked. Her hands trembled. She clutched a handkerchief, not to dry tears, but to ground herself from unraveling completely. Every day, I laid out the evidence with surgical precision. Encrypted emails showing conversations between her and Charles plotting financial moves, timelines that coincided with key dates in the divorce proceedings, flight records showing secret rendezvous just days after she filed for separation. I mapped out the web like an architect dismantling a structure he once helped build. Even when she brought in emotional journals and old photos of our happy years, they couldn't compete with bank transfers and travel records. She had played the part of the wounded woman well, but truth is not a role you can rehearse. The evidence did not weep or tremble. It stood, firm and objective, revealing a story she had hoped no one would ever read. As additional witnesses stepped forward, a retired airport security guard, a former bank employee, the puzzle became complete. No one could argue against what had been built. The judge took it all in with a practiced neutrality, but even he couldn't hide his shifting gaze. Lily was no longer the betrayed wife. She was the orchestrator of a betrayal. When the ruling was delivered, I sat perfectly still. The judge declared the prior division of assets null and void due to fraud. Every asset she had claimed was revoked. She was ordered to return all funds and beyond that was subject to criminal proceedings for financial fraud and asset misappropriation. She would no longer walk away with my home, my company, or the narrative she so carefully curated. Her empire of deception collapsed in the silence that followed. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't smile. I simply felt lighter, not with joy, but with release. The kind that comes when you've been holding your breath for too long and finally remember how to breathe. I had waited for this not out of vengeance, but because I needed the world to see the truth I had always known. I left the courthouse alone, slipping past reporters without a word. I didn't want headlines or applause. I didn't want to be a martyr or a victor. Justice is not a trophy. It is a restoration of what should never have been taken. I went home, made tea, and opened my laptop. I started writing again, not a lawsuit, not a manifesto, just reflections. I needed to remember every detail, not to preserve a battle, but to understand how close I had come to losing myself. In the weeks that followed, my company slowly stabilized. Investors, once spooked by scandal, began to return. A few emailed their apologies. They admitted they had judged too quickly, misled by tabloids and the seductive power of a well-acted victim. I didn't blame them. Lies often travel faster than truth. But I was done defending myself. The facts spoke loud enough now. I had lost a lot, my home, my reputation, years of trust. But in that final courtroom, I had reclaimed what mattered. My voice, my story, and the ability to walk into the mirror without flinching. That was the real victory. And in the quiet afterward, as the noise died down, I found peace, not from punishing someone who betrayed me, but from knowing I no longer lived under the weight of her shadow. The truth had come late, but it came. The trial ended with a bang, but what followed was not a celebration. It was silence, vast, echoing, and unfamiliar. I moved into a small, sparsely furnished apartment on the edge of the city, the kind of place that didn't ask questions, didn't carry memories in its walls, didn't expect permanence. There was no more marble countertop, no smart lighting system that adjusted with mood, no framed wedding photos in the hallway. It was empty, a blank canvas. And somehow that suited me. Every morning I woke up to the same view, gray rooftops, narrow alleyways, and a modest tree bending in the wind. I made tea instead of coffee now. Coffee had belonged to another life, the life where I rushed to meetings, scanned emails during breakfast, and kissed a woman who was already planning my downfall. Tea was slower. It asked nothing of me. It let me sit with the quiet. In the weeks that followed the verdict, the press moved on. The headline faded. My name stopped trending. The social media noise that had once felt like an avalanche reduced itself to a distant hum. Strangely, it was in that silence that the grief finally hit me, not grief over the money or the humiliation, but over the realization that everything I had loved had been built on a scaffold of illusion. I found myself unpacking not just boxes, but memories. Little things hurt the most. A worn-out hoodie she once stole from my closet and never returned. A half-burned scented candle she had loved. A playlist on my phone titled Our Sundays. I listened to it once, alone, in the dark, and the music gutted me. Not because I missed her, but because I missed the man I had been when I believed I was loved. Healing didn't come in big waves. It arrived in quiet rituals. I started walking in the evenings, not with a destination in mind, but just to move, to breathe. I bought a notebook and began writing again, not about her, not about courtrooms or betrayal, but about myself. Who I had been, who I might become. I needed to understand how I had lost myself so thoroughly in someone else's version of reality. There were days when anger surged, raw, sharp, unjustified by logic. I would catch myself clenching my fists at nothing in particular. But anger, I realized, was just pain wearing armor. And I was tired of armor, tired of war. I wanted to live softly again. I reconnected with my younger self, the version of me before ambition drowned out instinct. I started painting in the early mornings. Not well, I had no formal training, but with honesty, abstract colors, harsh lines, gentle curves, a mess really, but mine. I bought second-hand canvases, reused old brushes, turned my kitchen table into a studio. Art didn't ask me to be brilliant. It only asked me to show up. People often assume justice brings closure. That winning makes the pain evaporate. But winning a war does not erase the battlefield inside you. I still had to sweep through the ruins. I still had to stare down the parts of me that allowed the betrayal to fester. The people pleaser, the peacekeeper, the blind optimist who ignored red flags out of fear of being alone. I spent months rebuilding my company, but this time I worked less. I learned to say no. I let go of clients who didn't respect boundaries. I made time for things that didn't generate revenue but made me feel human, cooking, reading, sitting in the sun. Slowly, I turned from a CEO to a man who happened to run a company, not be consumed by it. My friendships changed too. Some people had vanished during the scandal. Others had stayed even when it cost them. I reached out to the latter. We had long walks and longer conversations, often without saying much. Just presence. I realized I didn't need advice or sympathy, I just needed to be seen without judgment. Eventually, I wrote the book. Not for revenge, not to shame her, but as a reckoning, a way to tell the story from my perspective without apology. I titled it She Took Half My Fortune, but I took back my whole life. It was raw, vulnerable, and honest. I included the ugly parts, my mistakes, my blindness, my failures. I didn't try to be a hero. I just wanted to be real. The book found its readers. Thousands, then tens of thousands. Messages poured in from people who had lived their own quiet hells, men and women alike, silenced by shame, betrayed by people they once trusted blindly. They thanked me for saying what they couldn't, for being angry without being cruel, for grieving without bitterness, for surviving without becoming hard. That, more than anything, became my healing, knowing I had turned my pain into something that helped someone else feel less alone. That my worst chapter had become someone else's roadmap out of darkness. I never heard from Lily again. I don't know where she went after the trial. I don't check. I don't wonder. Not because I hate her, but because she no longer belongs in the story I'm writing. She's a closed chapter, a completed lesson. I carry the scar, but I no longer feel the wound. I fell in love again, not with a person, but with life, with simple joys, a perfectly made omelet, a street musician playing an off-key violin, a book that makes you cry in public. I discovered that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without bleeding. There are still moments when I walk past a familiar place and my chest tightens. A restaurant where we once celebrated an anniversary. A bench where we shared a laugh that felt eternal at the time. But now I let the memory pass like wind. I don't chase it. I don't fight it. I let it move through me. I learned that forgiveness is not about absolving the other person. It's about freeing yourself from the grip of what they did. I forgave her not because she deserved it, but because I deserved peace. She took a version of me with her, the naive dreamer, the blind believer, but she didn't take the core. That survived. Sometimes I look in the mirror and barely recognize the man staring back. He's older, more weathered. His eyes are heavier. But there's a steadiness there, a depth that didn't exist before. He knows things now about pain, about loss, about resilience. And strangely, I like him more than the man I used to be. Because this version of me doesn't need perfection. He doesn't seek validation in someone else's eyes. He stands alone quietly with his flaws and his truths and knows that he is enough. I didn't lose everything. I lost someone who no longer loved me and maybe never did. And in losing her, I found myself again.